The morning of October 14th smelled like burnt coffee and fallen leaves. Earl Hutchins stood at the kitchen window of the house he'd owned for 47 years, watching the maple tree in the front yard shed its crimson coat onto the lawn he'd mowed every Saturday since Nixon was in office. The radiator behind him clicked and hissed, that same metallic rhythm he'd promised Lorraine he'd fix back in 1989. He never did fix it. Some things you just learn to live with. Earl was 73 years old. His hands were mapped with scars from 4 decades at the Bethlehem steel mill before it closed, then another decade doing welding jobs out of his garage until his shoulders finally gave out. Those hands had built this life, every nail in the back deck, every replaced shingle on the roof, every dollar that went into the joint savings account that now, according to the documents he'd found last week, contained exactly $412. $412 after 50 years of marriage. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Earl didn't like cell phones, never had. Lorraine had insisted he get one 5 years ago. For emergencies, she'd said. He used it to check the weather and occasionally receive pictures of his grandchildren from his daughter Nettie, who lived in Colorado now and visited once a year if they were lucky. He picked up the phone. One new message from Lorraine Strange. Lorraine was upstairs. He could hear the floorboards creaking in their bedroom, the familiar percussion of her morning routine, the squeak of the closet door, the groan of the old dresser drawer she'd been asking him to fix since Reagan was president. He opened the message. 6 words that detonated 50 years of everything. I'm leaving you. I'm already gone. Earl read it 3 times. His coffee cup, the one with the faded Pittsburgh Steelers logo, a Father's Day gift from Nettie back in 1987, slipped from his fingers and shattered on the linoleum floor. Brown liquid spread across the yellowed tiles like something bleeding out. Upstairs the creaking stopped, then footsteps, measured, deliberate, coming down the stairs. Earl didn't move, couldn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on that phone screen, on those 6 words, as if staring long enough might rearrange them into something that made sense. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Earl. He looked up. Lorraine stood in the doorway of the kitchen. She was dressed in clothes he'd never seen before. A navy blazer, pressed slacks, a silk scarf around her neck. Her grey hair, usually pinned up in the same practical bun she'd worn for 30 years, was styled differently, softer. She looked like a stranger wearing his wife's face. Behind her, through the screen door, Earl could see a silver sedan idling in the driveway. A car he didn't recognize. A man's silhouette behind the wheel. "I left a letter on your nightstand," Lorraine said. Her voice was calm, rehearsed. "It explains everything. I'm sorry it had to be this way, but I couldn't do one more day, not one more." Earl opened his mouth, but no words came out. "I've already talked to a lawyer," she continued. "You can keep the house. I don't want anything from you, Earl. I just want—" She paused. For the first time, something flickered across her face, something almost like grief. "I just want to feel alive again before it's too late." And then she was gone. The screen door slapped shut. The silver sedan's engine revved, tires crunched on gravel, grew distant and disappeared. Earl stood in his kitchen, coffee soaking into his wool socks, the radiator clicking its broken rhythm, holding a cell phone with 6 words on the screen. 50 years. Gone in a text message. To understand the earthquake, you first have to understand the fault lines. Earl Hutchins met Lorraine Capelli in the summer of 1974 at a church picnic in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He was 23. She was 21. He'd just started full-time at the mill after 2 years of part-time work through high school, and he had $70 in his pocket, the most money he'd ever had at one time. She was standing by the lemonade table, wearing a yellow sundress that caught the afternoon light, laughing at something her sister had said. Earl wasn't good with women, never had been. His father, a hard man who worked the same mill until black lung took him at 54, had never taught him how to talk to people, only how to work. But something about Lorraine, maybe the way she laughed without covering her mouth, or the way she actually looked at him when he finally worked up the nerve to say hello, made him feel like maybe, for once, he wasn't invisible. They were married 6 months later. The early years were hard. Every year was hard. But the early ones wore a different kind of hardness, the kind you could almost mistake for adventure when you were young and stupid enough to believe that love could survive anything. They lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store on 4th Street. The pipes froze every winter. In summer, the heat rose from the asphalt like a physical thing, turning their little apartment into a sweatbox. Lorraine worked as a secretary at a dental office. Earl pulled doubles at the mill whenever he could get them, coming home with his clothes soaked through and his skin smelling of iron and sweat. They saved everything, every penny, every dime. By 1976, they had enough for a down payment on a small house on Maple Drive, a 2-bedroom Cape Cod with a sloping roof and a backyard just big enough for a vegetable garden. It wasn't much. The previous owner had let it fall into disrepair, and Earl spent every weekend for 3 years fixing what was broken, replacing what couldn't be fixed, turning that sad little house into something resembling a home. Lorraine planted flowers, marigolds and petunias and roses along the front walk. She sewed curtains for the windows. She found an old dining table at a church rummage sale and refinished it herself, sanding and staining until the wood gleamed like honey in the afternoon light. Those were the good years, or at least Earl had always believed they were the good years. Looking back now, standing in that same kitchen with coffee drying on his socks, he wasn't so sure anymore. He thought about the letter on the nightstand. He hadn't gone upstairs to read it yet, couldn't bring himself to. It felt like a bomb waiting to detonate, and some part of him believed that if he just didn't read it, maybe none of this would be real. But he knew. Deep down, in that place where men keep the truths they're too afraid to examine, Earl Hutchins knew. The cracks had always been there. The first crack appeared in 1982. Lorraine wanted to go back to school. She'd been talking about it for months. Nursing school, she said. The community college in Bethlehem had a program. She could do it part-time, work around Nettie's schedule. Nettie was 5 by then, just started kindergarten, and Lorraine had been home with her since she was born. "I need something that's mine," Lorraine had said one night, sitting across from him at that honey-colored dining table. "I love being a mother. I love this family, but I need something else. Something that's just for me." Earl had nodded, said he understood, said they'd figure it out, but the math didn't work, tuition was expensive. They were still paying off the house. Earl's wages at the mill were good, but not good enough. And there was talk, always talk back then, about layoffs coming. The Japanese were eating into the steel market. The union was nervous. Everyone was nervous. "Maybe next year," Earl had said, "once we're on better footing." Next year became the year after. The year after became 5 years, 10. By the time the finances might have allowed it, Nettie was in high school and Lorraine had stopped asking. Earl had told himself it was practical, responsible. He was protecting his family, making the hard choices so they didn't have to. But Lorraine's eyes had changed after that. A light that used to live there, that laughing, reckless light from the church picnic, had dimmed. Just a little. Just enough that Earl could pretend not to notice. The second crack came in 1991. Lorraine's mother died that February. A stroke, sudden and merciless. One day she was complaining about the cold, the next she was gone. Lorraine fell apart. For weeks she could barely get out of bed. She cried in the shower, she cried at the grocery store, she cried in her sleep, making sounds that made Earl's chest ache with helplessness. He didn't know what to do. Earl was a fixer. His whole life he'd solved problems with his hands. Broken thing? Fix it. Leaky pipe? Replace it. But grief wasn't something you could weld back together. It wasn't something you could hammer into shape. So he did what he knew how to do. He worked. He picked up extra shifts. He told himself it was for the money, funeral expenses, medical bills, all the practical things that death leaves behind. But really, if he was honest with himself, it was because the mill was the only place where he felt useful, the only place where his presence meant something, where his hands could do the work his heart couldn't figure out. He was gone 14, 16 hours a day. When he came home, Lorraine was usually already asleep or pretending to be. They stopped talking, really talking. The kind of talking where you share the inside of yourself, where you let someone see the messy, scared, uncertain parts. Instead, they talked about bills, grocery lists, whether the gutter needed to be cleaned before the next rain. They talked about everything except what mattered, and slowly, invisibly, the distance between them grew. The third crack, the biggest one, came in 1998. Earl came home early from work one Thursday. The mill had sent everyone home. There'd been an accident on the line, a man crushed between two rollers, and the whole plant shut down while OSHA investigated. Earl walked through the front door at 2 in the afternoon, earlier than he'd been home in years. Lorraine was sitting at the kitchen table. She wasn't alone. Across from her sat a man Earl didn't recognize. Mid-50s, grey hair, wearing a sport coat, and an expression that rearranged itself quickly when Earl walked in. On the table between them were brochures. Glossy brochures with pictures of buildings, classrooms, smiling people in white coats. "Earl," Lorraine said, standing up quickly. Too quickly. "You're home early." "Mill's shut down," he said, his eyes moving from her to the stranger to the brochures and back again. "What's going on?" The stranger stood, extending his hand. "Mr. Hutchins, I'm Bernard Crane. I'm an admissions counselor at—" "He was just leaving," Lorraine interrupted, her voice tight. She gathered the brochures, stuffing them into a folder. "It's nothing, it's nothing." Bernard Crane looked between them, recognized something Earl couldn't name, and excused himself with a mumbled apology. After he left, the silence in that kitchen was absolute. "Nursing school," Lorraine finally said, not meeting his eyes. "There's a program. I was just looking into it, behind my back, because I knew what you'd say." Earl stared at her. This woman he'd married, this woman he'd built a life with, this woman he suddenly realized he barely knew at all. "I would have listened," he said. Lorraine laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. "When, Earl? When would you have listened? Before or after your 14-hour shift? Before or after you fall asleep in your chair at 8 o'clock every night? When do you ever listen to anything I say?" He didn't have an answer for that, because she was right. After 1998, something fundamental shifted. They didn't fight. Earl and Lorraine weren't fighters. They were suppressors, avoiders. They built their marriage on the same philosophy Earl's parents had modeled. You don't talk about the hard things. You push them down. You keep going. You survive. And so they survived. 20 more years. Through Nettie's wedding. Through grandchildren. Through Earl's retirement from the mill in 2012, when they gave him a gold watch and a handshake, and sent him home to a wife who looked at him like a stranger who'd overstayed his welcome. They slept in the same bed, but they lived in different worlds. Lorraine joined a book club, a gardening society. She started volunteering at the library 3 days a week. She made friends Earl had never met, attended events he was never invited to, lived a life that existed entirely outside the walls of the house he'd built for her. Earl sat in his garage, surrounded by tools he no longer had the strength to use, and wondered where his life had gone. He told himself it was fine. This was just what marriage became after a certain point. The passion faded. The companionship remained. They were partners, even if they weren't lovers. They were teammates, even if they played for different teams. He told himself a lot of lies, and then October 14th came, and 6 words on a phone screen blew every lie apart. The coffee on the floor had dried into a sticky brown stain. The broken mug lay in pieces, untouched. The radiator continued its broken clicking, and outside the autumn wind stripped more leaves from the maple tree, sending them skittering across the empty driveway. He should read the letter. He knew he should read the letter. But Earl had survived 73 years on this earth by avoiding the things that scared him. The hard conversations, the emotional reckonings, the moments that required him to be something other than a man who worked, who provided, who showed up and did what needed to be done without complaint. Reading that letter meant confronting 50 years of failure. It meant looking at his marriage, really looking at it, and seeing all the places where he'd fallen short. He wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, he did what he always did when the world stopped making sense. He started fixing something. He found a broom, swept up the broken mug, mopped the floor, checked the radiator for the 100th time, and jiggled the valve that always stuck, producing a small hiss of steam and a temporary silence. Then he went to the garage. Earl's garage was his sanctuary. 200 square feet of organized chaos. Pegboards lined with tools. a workbench scarred by decades of projects, shelves stacked with coffee cans full of screws and bolts and washers. The smell in here was equal parts motor oil and sawdust, a perfume that had seeped into his skin so deeply he didn't notice it anymore. He sat on the old stool by the workbench and stared at nothing. His phone buzzed. Another text message. His heart lurched. Maybe it was Lorraine saying she'd made a mistake, saying she was coming home, but when he looked at the screen, it was from his daughter. Nettie. "Dad, Mom called me. Are you okay? I'm booking a flight. I'll be there tomorrow." Earl stared at the message for a long time. His daughter knew, which meant Lorraine had planned this, had coordinated this, had reached out to Nettie before sending that text, making sure their daughter would be there to pick up the pieces. How long had she been planning this? That question burrowed into his brain like a splinter. Days? Weeks? Months? How long had Lorraine been living in their house, sleeping in their bed, eating at their table, while quietly dismantling everything they'd built? Earl set the phone down. His hands were trembling. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt something other than numbness. He felt angry. The letter was exactly where Lorraine said it would be, on his nightstand, tucked beneath his reading glasses like a coiled snake waiting to strike. Earl picked it up, turned it over. It was heavier than he expected, multiple pages, folded precisely into thirds. He sat on the edge of the bed, their bed, the bed they'd shared for 47 years in this house, and opened it. Lorraine's handwriting was as neat and controlled as ever. No tears had stained the pages. No hesitation marked the letters. This was the letter of someone who had thought carefully about every word, every comma, every period. "Dear Earl, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know that seems cruel, a text message to end 50 years. You deserve better. But I've been trying to find the words for decades, and I finally realized that if I waited until I had the perfect words, I'd wait forever. So I'm leaving imperfectly, messily, in a way that will hurt you and confuse you and make you hate me, and I have to be okay with that. I need you to understand something. I loved you. I really did. That girl at the church picnic in 1974 saw something good in you, something solid and real, and she wasn't wrong. You are a good man, Earl. You worked hard your whole life. You provided for this family. You never drank. You never hit. You never cheated. By every metric that matters, you were a successful husband. But I am dying, Earl. Not physically, spiritually, emotionally. I have spent 50 years making myself small so you could feel big. 50 years swallowing my dreams so yours could breathe. 50 years sitting alone in the dark, waiting for a conversation that never came, waiting for you to see me, really see me, and ask what I wanted from this life. You never asked, not once. I'm not writing this to hurt you. I'm writing this because I think, somewhere inside that thick skull of yours, you already know. You've known for years that we were roommates, not partners. You've known that every time I tried to reach for something more, school, travel, a life outside these four walls, you found a reason to say no. Not directly, of course. You never said no directly. You just made it impossible. The finances weren't right. The timing wasn't right. Nettie needed me. The house needed me. You needed me. Everyone needed me. Except no one ever asked what I needed. I'm 71 years old. I have, if I'm lucky, 10 or 15 years left. And I absolutely refuse, to spend those years sitting in that kitchen, watching you fall asleep in front of the television, waiting for a version of our marriage that was never going to arrive. There's someone else. I'm not going to apologize for that. His name is Gerald. We met at the library 2 years ago. He's a retired professor. He reads poetry. He asks me questions and actually listens to my answers. He makes me feel, for the first time in decades, like I'm a person and not just a function. I know that sounds unforgivable. Maybe it is, but I'd rather be unforgivable than invisible. You can keep the house. I don't want anything from the accounts, what's left of them anyway. I just want to start over. Whatever time I have left, I want to live it on my own terms. I'm sorry, Earl. I really am, not for leaving. I should have done that years ago. But for not having the courage to say any of this out loud, for letting silence do the work that honesty should have done. You deserved better. We both did. Lorraine Earle read the letter 3 times. Then he set it down on the nightstand, walked to the bathroom, and vomited into the toilet. The retching went on for several minutes, his body expelling something poison, though his stomach was empty. When it finally stopped, he sat on the cold tile floor, his back against the tub, and let the tears come. He hadn't cried since his father's funeral in 1985. Now 40 years of grief came flooding out at once. Grief for his marriage, for his wife, for the man he'd thought he was, and the man he apparently had been instead. 50 years making myself small so you could feel big. Was that true? Had he done that? He thought about the nursing school brochures, the way Lorraine's face had closed off after 1998, the gradual retreat, year by year, into separate lives that happened to share the same address. He thought about all the times he could have asked, should have asked, what she was thinking, what she wanted, what she dreamed about. He thought about how he never did, not once. The truth of that settled into his bones like ice. When Nettie arrived the next afternoon, she found her father in the garage, sorting through a coffee can of mismatched screws, like a man trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. Dad. Earl looked up. His daughter was 47 years old now, with grey streaking her brown hair and worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there the last time he'd seen her. She was wearing jeans and a fleece jacket, and she looked exhausted. "Hi, Nettie bird." She crossed the garage and hugged him fiercely. He let her, his arms wrapping around her like she was still the little girl who used to fall asleep on his chest during Saturday afternoon movies. "I'm so sorry, Dad." Earl shook his head. "Nothing to be sorry for. Mom told me everything, about Gerald, about—" She pulled back, searching his face. "How are you?" It was such a simple question, and so impossible to answer. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't think I've figured that out yet." Nettie nodded. She'd inherited his emotional reserve, the way he packaged feelings into small, manageable boxes, but she'd also inherited something from her mother, a willingness to pry those boxes open when it mattered. "Have you eaten anything?" "Not hungry." "Dad, there's some soup in the— I'm making you dinner, real dinner." She started toward the house, then stopped, turning back. "Did you read her letter?" Earl was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah. And?" "And I don't know what to do with any of it." He set down the coffee can. 50 years, Nettie. 50 years I thought I knew that woman. Thought I knew us. Turns out I didn't know a damn thing." Nettie's eyes were wet. "She's not a villain, Dad. I know it feels that way right now, but I don't think she's a villain." Earl's voice was quiet. "I think she was lonely. I think she was lonely for a very long time, and I was too busy being me to notice." The admission hung in the air between them. "That's very self-aware," Nettie said finally. "It's the truth. Took me 73 years to see it, but there it is." He stood, his knees cracking in protest. "Come on. Let's go inside. I'll help you with dinner." Over the next week, Earl began the strange, disorienting work of unraveling a half-century of shared life. He found things, small things at first. A receipt in Lorraine's desk drawer from a restaurant he'd never heard of, dated 3 months ago. A birthday card signed G with a heart drawn beneath the initial. A burner phone, an actual burner phone, the kind you saw in crime dramas, hidden in a shoebox in the back of her closet, its call history filled with numbers Earl didn't recognize. Larger things, too. The joint savings account that should have held their retirement, 40 years of careful deposits, a nest egg that had grown to nearly $800,000 by Earl's last calculation 5 years ago, now held only $412. The transfers had been happening for years. Small amounts at first, 2,000 here, 5,000 there, then larger and larger sums funneled into an account Earl had never known existed. An account in Lorraine's name only. An account that now held $763,000. Earl sat at the kitchen table with bank statements spread before him, doing math that made his head spin and his stomach churn. She hadn't just left him. She'd taken everything. "You need a lawyer," Nettie said when he showed her the paperwork. Her face had gone pale, then red, cycling through shock into fury. "Dad, this is—" This is theft. This is financial abuse. She's my wife. She's a thief who stole your retirement. Nettie was pacing now, her boots clicking on the kitchen floor. You worked 40 years at that mill. 40 years of breaking your back so you two could have a comfortable retirement, and she just took it? Earl didn't have an answer for that. I'm calling a lawyer, Nettie said, reaching for her phone. There has to be something we can do. Community property laws, marital assets. Nettie, and I want to talk to whoever Gerald is, because I have some questions about... Nettie. Earl's voice was sharp enough to stop her mid-sentence. Sit down. She sat. I'm angry, Earl said slowly. Don't mistake me for not being angry. I'm so angry I can barely see straight. But I'm also 73 years old, and I've been married to that woman for half a century, and somewhere in all that time, I failed her badly enough that she felt like this was her only option. Dad, that's not... Let me finish. He took a breath. Your mother is a lot of things. Selfish, secretive, maybe even cruel doing it this way, but she's not a monster. She's a woman who spent 50 years swallowing herself whole, and when she finally decided to spit herself back out, she made damn sure she had the means to survive. Nettie's eyes were wet again. You're defending her? No, I'm trying to understand her. Earl picked up one of the bank statements. I'm going to get a lawyer. I'm going to protect what I can, but I'm also going to try to figure out what went so wrong for so long that this was where we ended up. Because if I don't understand that, I'm just going to be angry forever. And I'm too old for that, Nettie Bird. I'm too damn old. She was 62 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and glasses that sat on the end of her nose like a permanent accusation. Her office was in downtown Allentown, on the third floor of a building that had probably been grand once, but now showed its age in water stains and creaking floorboards. Earl liked her immediately. 50 years of marriage, Harriet said, flipping through the documents Earl had brought. And she drained the accounts over what period? Best I can tell, about 15 years. Started small, got bigger. Harriet made a note. And you never noticed? She handled the bills, always did. Earl felt his face flush with something that might have been shame. I worked. She managed the house, division of labor. Harriet's expression was unreadable. Did you ever ask to see the accounts? A few times. Early on, she always said everything was fine. Showed me statements that looked normal, I guess. I trusted her. Fraudulent statements, likely. They're easy enough to fake if you know what you're doing. Harriet set down her pen. Mr. Hutchins, I'm going to be honest with you. What your wife did is legally complicated. Marital assets are jointly owned, which means technically she had the right to access those funds. However, if she deliberately concealed her actions and misrepresented the family's financial position, that could constitute fraud. So I have a case. You might. But here's the thing about cases, Mr. Hutchins. They take time, they take money. And at the end of the day, even if you win, you might spend more in legal fees than you recover. She leaned back in her chair. I'm not saying don't pursue this. I'm saying be realistic about what you're pursuing and why. Earl thought about Lorraine's letter, about Gerald, about all the years of silence. What I want, he said slowly, is to understand what happened. The money matters. I'm not pretending it doesn't, but what I really need is to know the truth, the whole truth, about her, about us, about where all of this went wrong. Harriet studied him for a long moment. That's an unusual priority for a client in your position. I'm an unusual man. Something that might have been a smile flickered across her face. All right, Mr. Hutchins, let me tell you what I can do. I have a colleague, forensic accountant very good at following money trails, who might be able to help us piece together where those funds went. We'll build a timeline. We'll document everything, and then, armed with that information, you can decide how you want to proceed. That sounds fair. Fair is what we're aiming for. Harriet stood, extending her hand. One more thing, Mr. Hutchins. In my experience, when someone goes to the lengths your wife went to, it's rarely about the money alone. There's usually something else, something she was building or running from or running toward. What do you mean? I mean the money went somewhere, and I'd bet my practice that somewhere is a story you haven't heard yet. The forensic accountant was a young man named Desmond Gray, 35 maybe, with an earnest face and the kind of energy that made Earl tired just watching him. They met at Harriet's office a week later, surrounded by stacks of financial records that Desmond had compiled with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "Okay, so here's what we're looking at," Desmond said, spreading documents across the conference table like a general planning an invasion. The withdrawals started in 2009. Small amounts, 2,000 here, 3,000 there, routed through a series of auxiliary accounts. Pretty standard asset concealment, but nothing that would raise red flags on a casual review. "And it escalated?" Harriet asked. "Significantly. By 2015, we're looking at monthly transfers of 10 to 15,000. And then," Desmond pointed to a highlighted section of one statement, "in 2019, there's a major withdrawal, $200,000 all at once to an LLC called Meridian Ventures." Earl frowned. "What's Meridian Ventures?" "That's where it gets interesting." Desmond pulled up another document, Articles of Incorporation from the state of Pennsylvania. Meridian Ventures is a real estate holding company, registered to a Gerald B. Krause of Eastern Pennsylvania. The name hit Earl like a physical blow. Gerald. From Lorraine's letter. "His name is Gerald. We met at the library 2 years ago, except according to these documents, their financial entanglement began in 2019, 6 years ago. Which meant either Lorraine had lied in her letter, or the relationship with Gerald was far deeper and far older than she'd admitted. "She invested in his company," Earl said quietly. "With my money." "Your joint money, yes." Desmond's expression was sympathetic. "There's more. Meridian Ventures owns 3 properties in the Lehigh Valley area, 2 apartment buildings and a small commercial complex. Based on current market values, those properties are worth approximately $1.2 million. Harriet let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of money." "It's my retirement," Earl said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "Every dollar I made for 40 years, she turned it into real estate with her boyfriend." The word boyfriend felt absurd coming out of his mouth, like something a teenager would say. "But what else did you call the man your wife had been secretly building a financial empire with?" "There's one more thing," Desmond said, hesitating. "I wasn't sure if I should bring it up, but I did some digging on Gerald Krause, just out of curiosity. And he's been married 4 times. All of his previous wives were, well, significantly older than him, and all of them seem to have experienced similar financial situations. Large transfers of assets into his control, followed by the dissolution of the marriage." The room went silent. "You're saying he's a con man," Harriet said. "I'm saying there's a pattern. Whether it rises to the level of criminal fraud, I can't say. But at the very least, he's someone who has made a career out of relationships with wealthy, or potentially wealthy, older women." Earl stared at the documents spread before him. The account transfers, the property records, the cold clinical paper trail of his wife's betrayal. But now, for the first time, something else flickered beneath the anger. Something that almost looked like concern. "Lorraine doesn't have money," he said slowly. "She was a secretary. Everything in that account, everything in those properties came from my wages. If this Gerald is what you're suggesting he is, then your wife may be his latest mark," Harriet finished grimly, "and by the time she realizes it, there may be nothing left." Earl had spent the week since Lorraine left cycling through the familiar stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, the whole miserable carousel. He'd cast himself in the role of victim, the faithful husband abandoned after 50 years of devotion. But now, armed with Desmond's research, the picture was more complicated. Yes, Lorraine had betrayed him. Yes, she'd lied, stolen, and abandoned their marriage without the basic courtesy of a face-to-face conversation. But she'd also walked straight into the arms of a man who appeared to specialize in targeting vulnerable women. A man who had built a career, possibly a criminal enterprise, on false romance and financial exploitation. What did that make Lorraine? A villain? A victim? Maybe both. Maybe they all were. It was the library where Lorraine volunteered, where she'd supposedly met Gerald 2 years ago, or 6, depending on which version of the truth you believed. Earl had never visited. Libraries weren't his territory. Too quiet, too still. But he needed to understand. He walked through the stacks, past the fiction section, past the children's area with its cheerful murals of talking animals. At the back of the building, he found what he was looking for, the volunteer coordinator's office. The woman behind the desk was in her 60s, with kind eyes and a name tag that read Dolores. "Can I help you?" Earl hesitated. He hadn't really thought this through. "I'm looking for information about one of your volunteers, Lorraine Hutchins." Dolores's expression shifted, surprise, then something guarded. "Are you a family member?" "I'm her husband." A long pause. "I see. She left a week ago, very suddenly. I'm trying to understand some things." Dolores studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Why don't you sit down, Mr. Hutchins?" Earl sat. "Lorraine and I were friendly," Dolores began. "She started volunteering here about 5 years ago. Very dedicated, always on time. The patrons loved her." She hesitated. "But about 2 years ago, things started to change." "Change how?" "She became distracted, less present. She disappeared during her shifts, take long phone calls in the break room, and she started talking about someone new, a man named Gerald." Earl felt his jaw tighten. What did she say about him? That he was wonderful, cultured, that he saw her in a way she'd never been seen before. Dolores's expression softened with something like pity. "I don't mean to be cruel, Mr. Hutchins, but she spoke about him the way a teenage girl speaks about her first love. It was intense." "Did you ever meet him?" "Once. He came to pick her up after a shift. Very charming, well-dressed, but there was something—" She trailed off. "What?" "I can't quite explain it. Something performative, like he was playing a role." Dolores shook her head. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you want to hear." "No," Earl said quietly. "But it's what I need to hear." He tracked down Gerald Krause's second ex-wife, a woman named Patricia who lived in Scranton, and spoke about her former husband with a bitterness that felt like rust. "He swept me off my feet," Patricia told him over the phone. "Flowers, dinners, poetry. God, the man could quote poetry like nobody's business. Made me feel like I was living in a romance novel. And then he convinced me to consolidate our finances. For simplicity, he said, for our future together." She laughed, a hard, brittle sound. "Within 2 years, he'd drained my savings, remortgaged my house, and disappeared with a woman 15 years younger than me. Classic predator. Classic con." "Did you go to the police?" "What could they do? Everything he took, I technically gave him. That's how he operates. He never forces anything. He makes you want to give it to him, makes you feel like it's your idea." Earl thanked her and hung up. Then he sat in his garage, surrounded by the tools of a life he no longer recognized, and thought about his wife. Lorraine wasn't a stupid woman. She was sharp, observant, a good judge of character, or at least he'd always thought so. How had Gerald gotten past her defenses? And then he realized Gerald hadn't needed to get past her defenses. He'd exploited the gaps Earl had left. All those years of silence, all those dreams deferred, all those moments when Lorraine had reached out for connection and found only empty air. Gerald had walked into that void and filled it with exactly what Lorraine had been starving for: attention, validation, the simple, devastating gift of being seen. The bed was too big, too empty. 50 years of sharing a mattress with another human being had programmed his body to expect warmth on the left side, the gentle rhythm of someone else's breathing in the dark. Now there was only silence and cold sheets and the endless loop of his own thoughts. He started sleeping in his recliner instead, the one in the living room with the worn leather arms and the permanent indent from his body. At least here alone had always been the expectation. It was on one of these sleepless nights, 3 in the morning, the house creaking around him like a ship at sea, that Earl made a decision. He wasn't going to be a victim. He wasn't going to rage and curse and spend whatever years he had left nursing a grudge that would only poison him from the inside out. He was going to do something. He was going to save his wife. First, he needed to understand Gerald's operation. Desmond's research had given him a foundation, but there were gaps, questions the financial records couldn't answer. He called Harriet. "I need to hire a private investigator," he said. A pause. "Earl, that's an expensive proposition, and frankly, I'm not sure what you'd gain from it." "I'd gain the truth, the whole truth, about Gerald, about where the money went, about what he's planning next. And then what? Even if we prove he's a con man, your wife went willingly. She transferred those assets of her own volition, legally. I know what the law says." Earl's voice was steady. "This isn't about the law anymore, Harriet. This is about Lorraine. She's been manipulated by someone who does this professionally. She doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. And I can't just let her walk off a cliff because I'm too proud to reach out a hand." Silence on the other end. Then, "You still love her?" It wasn't a question. Earl thought about the church picnic in 1974, the yellow sundress, the way she laughed without covering her mouth. "I never stopped," he said. "Even when I should have. Even when she made it damn near impossible. I never stopped." Harriet sighed. "All right. I know someone. She's good, thorough. But Earl, this is going to cost you, and there's no guarantee you'll like what she finds." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because in my experience, the truth rarely makes people feel better. It just gives them more to carry." Earl thought about the letter on his nightstand, the bank statements, the years of silence. "I'm already carrying more than I can handle," he said. "A little more won't make a difference." She was 45, with sharp eyes and a handshake that could crack walnuts. She operated out of a small office in Bethlehem, above a laundromat that filled the stairwell with the smell of fabric softener and steam. "So, let me make sure I understand," Carmen said, studying the file Earl had assembled. "Your wife leaves you after 50 years, takes most of your retirement savings, runs off with a guy who has a history of targeting older women, and instead of suing her for everything she's got, you want me to investigate the boyfriend." "That's right." "Why?" Earl had thought about how to answer this question, how to explain the tangle of emotions that had brought him to this cluttered office, sitting across from a woman half his age asking for help he wasn't sure he deserved. "Because I failed her," he said finally. "For 50 years I failed her in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. I can't undo that. I can't go back and be the husband she needed. But I can try to keep her from making the biggest mistake of her life." Carmen studied him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, not exactly warmth, but something approaching respect. "Most men in your position want revenge," she said. "Revenge won't bring back the years I wasted. It won't undo the damage, and it sure as hell won't help Lorraine see what's happening before it's too late. And if she doesn't want to be helped, if she looks at all the evidence we gather and tells you to go to hell?" Earl shrugged. "Then at least I'll know I tried. That's more than I can say for most of our marriage." Carmen nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Hutchins. I'll take your case. But I want you to understand something. What I find might not be pretty. In my experience, people like Gerald Krause, charming, manipulative, serial exploiters, they leave wreckage wherever they go. Your wife might be in deeper than you think. Then we'd better work fast." Within 2 weeks, she had compiled a dossier on Gerald Krause that read like a crime novel. 4 previous marriages, each ending with the wife's financial ruin. A string of business ventures that had left investors empty-handed. A civil suit in New Jersey that had been quietly settled out of court. And most damning, a current relationship with a woman in Bucks County who had no idea her boyfriend was simultaneously living with Lorraine. "He's running 2 cons at once," Carmen explained, spreading photographs across Earl's kitchen table. "Your wife thinks she's his partner. This other woman, her name is Dorothy Welch, 68, widowed, substantial inheritance, thinks she's his fiancée. He's got properties in both their names, money flowing in from both directions. Classic juggling act." Earl stared at the photographs. Gerald Krause smiling at a restaurant. Gerald Krause holding hands with Dorothy Welch at what looked like a gallery opening. Gerald Krause walking into an apartment building, the same building, Earl realized, where Lorraine was presumably living now. How does he keep them from finding out about each other? Careful scheduling, separate phones, lies layered on lies. Carmen shrugged. These guys are pros. They've had years to perfect their techniques, and honestly, Their victims usually don't want to see the truth. They've invested so much emotionally, financially, that admitting they've been conned feels worse than staying in the con. What about the real estate? The properties Desmond found? All in Gerald's name now. He convinced your wife to transfer her interest last month, simplifying the paperwork, he probably told her. Same thing he did with his previous victims. Carmen pulled out another document, a deed transfer signed by Lorraine Hutchins, dated just 2 weeks before she'd left. She gave away everything she stole from you, and she probably thought she was doing something smart. Earl felt sick. All that money, all those years of work, 40 years of his life, condensed into account transfers and property deeds, now sitting in the hands of a professional parasite. And Lorraine, proud, stubborn, secretly desperate Lorraine, had walked right into the trap. "What do we do?" Earl asked. Carmen leaned back in her chair. "That depends on what you want. If your goal is to recover assets, we can go the civil route. Sue Gerald for fraud, try to unwind the property transfers. It'll take years and cost a fortune, and honestly, guys like him are good at hiding money. By the time you get a judgment, there might be nothing left to collect. And if my goal is something else, such as..." Earl thought about his wife, about the woman who had laughed without covering her mouth, about the years of silence, the dreams deferred, the slow erosion of everything they might have been. "I want to expose him," Earl said. "Not in court, not through lawyers. I want Lorraine to see exactly who she threw away our life for. I want her to have all the information, the other women, the pattern, everything, and make her own choice with her eyes open." Carmen smiled for the first time since they'd met. It wasn't a kind smile exactly, more like the smile of someone who enjoyed watching dominoes fall. "Now we're talking," she said. "Let me tell you about something called a strategic disclosure." Gerald Krause operated in secrecy. His power came from controlling information, from keeping his victims isolated and ignorant. The moment that secrecy broke, the moment all his victims could compare notes, his entire operation would collapse. "We need to bring everyone together," Carmen explained. "Your wife, Dorothy Welch, the ex-wives who are willing to talk, maybe some of the business partners he's burned. We gather them in one place, present the evidence, and let them see the whole picture." "Lorraine won't come," Earl said. "Not if she knows I'm involved." "She doesn't have to know. Not at first." Carmen pulled out a sheet of paper. "Gerald's been planning a investor appreciation dinner next month. Very exclusive. He's been sending invitations to all his current marks, including Dorothy Welch. I'm betting Lorraine got one too." "How does that help us?" "Because we're going to crash that dinner." Carmen's eyes glittered. "And we're going to make sure every person in that room knows exactly who they're dealing with." Earl worked with Carmen and Harriet to compile the evidence into a presentation. Bank records, property transfers, testimony from ex-wives, photographs of Gerald with multiple women. Desmond created a timeline showing the pattern of exploitation stretching back 2 decades. They reached out to Patricia, Gerald's second ex-wife, who agreed to participate despite her reservations. "I spent years trying to warn people about him," she told Earl during one of their phone calls. "Nobody listened. They all thought I was just a bitter ex. Maybe this time will be different." They contacted Dorothy Welch through a carefully worded letter that revealed just enough to spark concern without triggering panic. Dorothy, after an initial period of denial, agreed to meet with Carmen in secret. "She cried for an hour when I showed her the photographs," Carmen reported afterward. "But she's angry now, that's good. Angry means she'll fight." And slowly, piece by piece, the trap came together. The investor appreciation dinner was scheduled for November 15th. It would be held at the Willoughby Room, an upscale event space in downtown Easton. Gerald had rented the entire venue, a not-so-subtle display of the wealth he'd accumulated from other people's life savings. The guest list included 15 people, current investors, potential marks, and, according to Carmen's intelligence, both Lorraine and Dorothy Welch. Earl's invitation came by way of a carefully forged document that Carmen had created. It listed him as a prospective investor referred by mutual connections. Gerald would have no reason to recognize the name. He'd never actually met Earl, despite entangling himself so thoroughly in Earl's life. "You sure you want to do this in person?" Carmen asked the night before. "I can handle the presentation. You don't need to be there." Earl shook his head. "I need to see her face when she finds out. I need to be there. It might not go the way you hope. I know. She might hate you for this. She probably will. But at least she'll have the truth. What she does with it." Earl shrugged. "That's up to her." Carmen studied him for a long moment. "You're a strange man, Earl Hutchins." "So I've been told." Earl put on the only suit he owned, a navy blue number he'd bought for Nettie's wedding 15 years ago, slightly tight across the shoulders now. He knotted his tie the way his father had taught him, back when ties still mattered for working men. He polished his shoes until they reflected the pale winter light streaming through the kitchen window. Nettie had flown in for the occasion. She stood in the doorway watching him prepare, her expression a complicated mixture of pride and fear. "You don't have to do this, Dad." "Yes, I do. She left you. She stole from you. She doesn't deserve—" "This isn't about what she deserves." Earl straightened his tie. "It's about what's right. And what's right is giving her a chance to see the truth before this man destroys her completely." Nettie's eyes were wet. "What if she doesn't listen?" "Then she doesn't listen, but I'll have tried. I'll have done everything I could." He turned to face his daughter. "For 50 years, Nettie Bird, I did the minimum. I showed up and I worked, and I thought that was enough. It wasn't. Not even close. This tonight, this is me trying to be the man I should have been all along." Nettie crossed the room and hugged him fiercely. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart. Now," he gently disentangled himself, "let's go crash a party." The Willoughby room occupied the top floor of a renovated warehouse overlooking the Delaware River. Earl arrived at 7:15, 15 minutes after the event had officially begun. He wanted Gerald to be settled, comfortable, confident that his performance was going exactly as planned. The elevator doors opened onto a space of exposed brick and soft lighting. Crystal chandeliers hung from original timber beams. A string quartet played something classical in the corner, Vivaldi maybe, or Bach. Earl didn't know enough about music to tell the difference. Approximately 40 people filled the room, drinking champagne and nibbling hors d'oeuvres. The investor list had apparently grown since Carmen's last intelligence report. Earl scanned the crowd. There, by the window, holding court in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Earl's car, was Gerald Krause. He was smaller than Earl had expected, maybe 5'8", with a slim build and carefully styled gray hair. Handsome in a polished, manufactured way. His smile was easy and practiced, his gestures expansive, his voice carrying just the right note of cultured warmth. Earl hated him on sight. And there, standing at Gerald's elbow, laughing at something he'd said, was Lorraine. Earl's breath caught. She looked different, younger somehow, despite everything. Her hair was styled, her dress was elegant, a deep blue number that matched her eyes. She was smiling in a way Earl hadn't seen in years. For one terrible moment he wondered if he was making a mistake. Maybe she really was happy. Maybe Gerald, for all his predatory history, genuinely loved her. Maybe Earl was about to destroy the only good thing that had happened to his wife in decades. Then he saw Dorothy Welch. She stood across the room, separated from Gerald and Lorraine by a sea of strangers. She was watching them with an expression that shifted between confusion and dawning horror, the look of someone whose reality was crumbling in real time. Carmen had done her work. Dorothy knew about Lorraine. She was seeing for the first time the double life that Gerald had been living. The dominoes were starting to fall. Harriet was stationed near the door, ready to block any escape route. Patricia, Gerald's second ex-wife, had arrived separately and was moving through the crowd, making contact with other investors, planting seeds of doubt. Everything was in place. At 7:45, Gerald moved to the small stage at the front of the room. He tapped a microphone, sending a small burst of feedback through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The crowd quieted. Faces turned toward the stage. "First, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. This gathering represents something truly special. A community of visionaries who understand that the best investments are built on trust, on relationships, on the belief that we can accomplish more together than we ever could alone." Earl watched Lorraine. She was gazing at Gerald with something approaching adoration. Her face was soft, open, vulnerable in a way Earl hadn't seen since those early years, when they were young and stupid and still believed that love could survive anything. His heart broke for her, and then hardened again. Over the past several years, Gerald continued, Meridian Ventures has grown from a modest vision into a thriving portfolio. Properties in the Lehigh Valley, commercial investments across 3 states, and most importantly, a family, yes, I call you family, of partners who share my commitment to building something lasting. He paused, his smile widening. Tonight, I want to share some exciting news with the support of our newest partners. He gestured toward Lorraine, who flushed with pleasure. Meridian Ventures is expanding. We're acquiring a new property complex in the Poconos, a luxury development that will generate substantial returns for years to come. This is the moment we've been working toward. This is... Excuse me. The voice came from the back of the room. Every head turned. Patricia stood in the doorway, her spine straight, her voice carrying with a clarity that cut through the ambient noise. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but I think the people in this room deserve to know who they're actually doing business with. Gerald's expression flickered, surprise, then annoyance, then something carefully controlled that might have been fear. I'm sorry, do I know you? You should. I was your wife, from 2006 to 2009, until you drained my savings and disappeared with my best friend. A murmur ran through the crowd. Gerald's smile tightened. I think there's been some misunderstanding. If you'd like to speak privately... No, I think everyone should hear this. Patricia stepped forward, and Carmen, on cue, powered on the projection system. The screen behind Gerald flickered to life. The first image, Gerald and Patricia's wedding photo dated 2006. This is me, Patricia said, on what I thought was the happiest day of my life. 6 months later, Gerald convinced me to merge our finances. Simplify things, he said. We're partners now. The screen changed. Bank statements, transfer records, the paper trail of exploitation. Within 2 years, he had taken everything, my savings, my retirement, my house, and when I tried to confront him, he told me I was crazy, that I'd agreed to everything, that it was my fault for not paying attention. Gerald held up his hands. This is defamation. I'm calling my lawyer. Call whoever you want. Patricia's voice was steel. But first, let me introduce you to someone. She gestured toward the crowd. Dorothy Welch stepped forward. Her face was pale but determined. She was holding a photograph, one of the pictures Carmen had shown her weeks ago. My name is Dorothy Welch, she said. Gerald and I have been together for 3 years. He told me he loved me. He told me I was the only one. Her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. Last month he proposed. I said yes. And then someone showed me this. She held up the photograph. It was a picture of Gerald and Lorraine, taken just 2 weeks ago. Holding hands, smiling, standing in front of the apartment building where presumably they'd been living together. Another murmur, louder now, edged with shock. Earl watched his wife's face. Lorraine's expression had frozen. She was staring at Dorothy, at the photograph, at the crumbling facade of everything she'd believed. That's not, Gerald started. Don't. Dorothy's voice cut like a blade. Don't you dare stand there and lie to me again. I know what you are now. I know what you've done to me, to Patricia, to... She turned to Lorraine. To her, whoever she is. The room had gone completely silent. Gerald stood at the microphone, his polished veneer finally cracking. His eyes darted around the room, calculating, searching for an escape route, a narrative, something he could use to regain control. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising. These women they're clearly disturbed. They've coordinated this attack to damage my reputation, to destroy everything I've built. We have documentation, Carmen said, stepping forward. Bank records, property transfers, testimony from former partners. Everything we've shown tonight is backed by evidence that will hold up in any court. And you are? My name is Carmen Reyes. I'm a private investigator. I was hired by one of your victims to expose your operation. Gerald's eyes swept the room, finally landing on Earl. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. He'd never met Earl, but he knew enough about Lorraine's past to guess who might be standing there in a 15-year-old wedding suit, watching everything burn. "You," Gerald said. "You're the husband, the one she left." Earl stepped forward. The crowd parted around him like water around a stone. "That's right. So this is what, revenge? You couldn't accept that she chose me, so you hired these people to destroy me." Earl shook his head slowly. "This isn't about you and me. This was never about you and me." He turned to face Lorraine. She was still frozen, her face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Shock, betrayal, anger, though it wasn't clear yet who the anger was directed at. "Lorraine." Her name hung in the air between them. "I read your letter," Earl continued. "Every word, and you were right, about all of it. I failed you. For 50 years I failed you in ways I didn't even understand. I was so busy working, providing, doing what I thought a husband was supposed to do. I forgot to ask what you actually needed." Lorraine's eyes were wet. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. "Earl, let me finish, please." He took a breath. "When you left, I was angry. Of course I was angry. You took everything. You didn't even give me the dignity of a face-to-face goodbye. And I wanted to hate you. Part of me still does." He paused. "But then I started digging, started understanding what happened. And I realized you didn't leave me for love. You left me for a man who told you exactly what you needed to hear, because that's what he does, that's all he does. He finds people who are hungry for something, attention, validation, feeling seen, and he exploits that hunger until there's nothing left." "That's not true." Lorraine's voice was stronger now, defensive. "Gerald loves me. He—" "Ask Dorothy." Earl's voice was gentle. "Ask Patricia. Ask any of the women he's burned through over the past 20 years. They all believed he loved them too." Lorraine turned to look at Dorothy. At Patricia. At the photograph still glowing on the screen behind Gerald's frozen figure. "No," she shook her head. "No, this is some kind of... You set this up. You're trying to manipulate me. I'm trying to save you." Earl stepped closer. "Lorraine, look at me. Look at me." Slowly, reluctantly, she met his eyes. "I know what I did wrong," he said. "I know I spent 50 years being half a husband. I know I let you down in ways I'm still discovering. But I never lied to you, not once. I never pretended to be something I wasn't. I was just not enough, and that's a different kind of failure." He gestured toward Gerald. "That man has been lying to you since the day you met. He's been running the same con for 20 years. And right now, tonight, you're standing at a crossroads. You can believe what he told you, or you can look at the evidence and decide for yourself." Lorraine's face crumpled. The composed, elegant woman who had walked into this room, who had laughed at Gerald's jokes and gazed at him with adoration, dissolved into something raw and wounded. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this? Why would you help me after everything I did?" Earl looked at his wife, his partner, the stranger who had shared his bed for 50 years. "Because you deserve to know the truth. And because," his voice caught, "because I still love you, even now, even after everything. I couldn't watch you destroy yourself without at least trying to stop it." The room had devolved into chaos. Several investors were already on their phones, presumably calling lawyers or financial advisors. Patricia and Dorothy had cornered Gerald, bombarding him with questions he couldn't answer. Carmen was gathering evidence, making sure every document was properly secured. And Lorraine was crying. Great, heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by strangers, watching everything she'd believed in crumble to dust. Earl walked toward her. "Don't touch me." Her voice was ragged. I don't." "Okay." He stopped a few feet away. "Okay, I won't." Everything he told me, every promise. "I know. I gave him everything, Earl, not just the money. Everything. I thought—" She choked on a sob. "I thought he was my second chance, my last chance to feel alive before—" "I know." She looked up at him. Her face was streaked with mascara, her elegant facade completely destroyed. She looked, Earl thought, more like herself than she had in years. "I was going to marry him," she whispered. He asked me last month. He said as soon as the divorce was finalized, he asked Dorothy too, same month, probably the same speech. Lorraine closed her eyes. I'm an idiot. No. Earl's voice was firm. You're a woman who was starving for something I never gave you. And a predator saw that and used it. That's not idiocy, that's vulnerability. And there's no shame in being vulnerable. She opened her eyes, studied his face like she was seeing it for the first time. Why aren't you angrier? You should be screaming at me. I took everything. You did, Earl nodded. And we're going to have to figure out what that means. Legally, financially, all of it. But that's for tomorrow. Tonight, the only thing that matters is that you see the truth. And now that I do, Earl shrugged. That's up to you. I'm not here to tell you what to do, Lorraine. I spent 50 years doing that in my own passive, suffocating way. I'm here to give you information. What you do with it, who you decide to be now, that's your choice. The confrontation with Gerald happened almost as an afterthought. He tried to leave, of course he did, slipping toward the emergency exit while the room was distracted. But Harriet was waiting there, along with 2 plainclothes police officers Carmen had tipped off earlier in the day. Gerald Krause? One of them said. Gerald's face went pale. Who are you? Detective Martinez, Eastern Police Department. We've received some interesting information about your business dealings. We'd like to ask you a few questions. This is harassment. I'm calling my lawyer. You can call whoever you want from the station. The detective gestured toward the door. This way, please. Gerald looked around the room, at the investors who had believed in him, at the women he had betrayed, at the paper trail of exploitation glowing on the screen behind him. His mask finally slipped. For just a moment, Earl saw the real Gerald Krause. Not the charming sophisticate, not the cultured lover of poetry, but a small, vicious man who had spent his life feeding on the loneliness of others. You'll regret this, Gerald said, his eyes finding Earl. All of you have no idea. Actually, Carmen interrupted, I think we have a very good idea. That's kind of the whole point. The detectives escorted Gerald from the room. The door closed behind him, and suddenly it was over. The aftermath of the confrontation played out in the crowded lobby of the Willoughby Room. Investors clustered in small groups, exchanging information and contact details, forming the bonds of mutual victimization that would eventually become a class-action lawsuit. Carmen moved among them, handing out business cards, offering to help with documentation and legal referrals. Patricia and Dorothy found each other. They stood in a corner, talking in low voices, united by the bizarre kinship of women who had loved the same lie. Every few minutes, one of them would cry or laugh or shake her head in disbelief, and Lorraine sat alone on a leather bench by the window, staring out at the Delaware River and the distant lights of the city beyond. Earl approached slowly, gave her plenty of space. Mind if I sit? She didn't answer, but she didn't tell him to leave either. He took that as permission. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the winter night pressed against the glass like something hungry. I don't know what to do now, Lorraine finally said. That makes 2 of us. I have nothing, Earl. The money's gone. Gerald, he transferred everything into his name. The properties, the investments. She laughed bitterly. I gave him everything I stole from you, and then he stole it from me. There's a certain poetry to that, I suppose. There might be something left. Harriet thinks we can challenge the property transfers. Fraud, coercion, there are legal avenues. Even if there are, it'll take years. And whatever's recovered, she shook her head. It doesn't matter. The money was never really the point. What was the point? Lorraine turned to look at him. Her eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, held something Earl hadn't seen in decades. Honesty. I wanted to be seen, she said. That's all I ever wanted. To be seen, to be heard. To matter to someone in a way that felt real. She paused. Gerald gave me that. Or he made me believe he did. The money was just... It was my way of building a life where that mattered. A life where I mattered. You mattered to me. Did I? Lorraine's voice wasn't accusatory, just sad. Because from where I was standing, Earl, I was furniture. I was part of the house, like the refrigerator or the back deck. Something functional, something you maintained, but not something you loved. Earl wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself. but the truth of her words cut too deep. "Maybe you're right," he said slowly. "Maybe that's exactly what you were to me. And if that's true," his voice caught, "then I owe you an apology that 50 years couldn't repay." Lorraine was quiet. "The ironic thing," she finally said, "is that this tonight is the most you've ever given me. The investigation, the intervention, actually fighting for me, even when I'd given you every reason not to." She shook her head. "Why couldn't you be this person before?" "I don't know." Earl's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know why I couldn't see what I was doing. Why I couldn't be the husband you needed. I just wasn't. And I'll spend whatever time I have left wondering if I could have been. And now? Now I don't know. We're 73 years old, Lorraine. We've lived more life than we have left. Maybe that means it's too late for us. Maybe the damage is done, and we just have to live with the consequences." He paused. "Or maybe it means we stop wasting time. Stop lying to ourselves and each other. Start actually talking, really talking, about what we want and who we are and whether there's anything left worth saving." Lorraine stared at him. In the low light of the lobby, her face was a map of the years, every wrinkle a story, every line a memory of the life they'd shared. "You're not asking me to come back," she said. "No, I'm not asking you anything. I'm just—" Earl struggled for words. "I'm saying the door's open. If you want to walk through it, if you want to really try to figure out what went wrong and whether it can be fixed, I'm here, that's all. And if I don't want that? If I want to walk away and never see you again?" Earl met her eyes. "Then I'll respect that. I'll hurt, but I'll respect it. You've spent 50 years doing what other people wanted. Maybe it's time you did what you want." Lorraine was silent for a long moment. Then slowly she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, thin, the hands of an old woman marked by time and labor and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. But they were still the hands that had held his on their wedding day, the hands that had touched his face when he came home from the mill, the hands that had built a life, imperfect, painful, but real, with his. "I don't know what I want," she said quietly. "I'm 71 years old and I've never known what I want. That's the tragedy of it. That's what I was trying to fix with Gerald, finally choosing something for myself. Except I chose wrong. I chose someone who was using me the same way I felt used by you." "So maybe the answer isn't choosing another person," Earl said. "Maybe the answer is choosing yourself first. Figuring out who Lorraine Hutchins is when she's not someone's wife or someone's mark, when she's just her." Lorraine's eyes were wet again. "And if I do that? If I take time to figure out who I am, would you wait? I've spent 50 years not knowing how to love you properly. I think I can spend a little longer learning." The weeks after the confrontation were a strange, quiet time. Earl went back to the house on Maple Drive. The radiator still clicked. The maple tree had lost all its leaves now, standing bare and skeletal against the grey November sky. The coffee mug he'd broken, the one with the faded Steelers logo, had been swept up and thrown away, but the memory of that moment remained, pressed into the floorboards like an invisible stain. Lorraine didn't come home. Not right away. She stayed with Nettie for a while, flew out to Colorado with nothing but a suitcase and the clothes on her back. Nettie called every few days with updates. Mom was quiet. Mom was reading a lot. Mom had started seeing a therapist. Earl approved. He didn't say so out loud, but he approved. He started seeing a therapist himself, actually. A man named Dr. Petrovich, who operated out of a small office in downtown Allentown. Earl felt ridiculous at first. A 73-year-old steelworker talking about his feelings with a stranger. But Dr. Petrovich was patient and direct. The kind of man Earl could respect. "You're dealing with a lot of guilt," Dr. Petrovich observed during their third session. "Guilt about the marriage, guilt about Lorraine, guilt about the man you weren't. Shouldn't I feel guilty? Maybe. But guilt only helps if it leads to change. Otherwise it's just another way of punishing yourself. And what should I be changing?" Dr. Petrovich leaned back in his chair. "That's the question, isn't it?" Carmen's evidence had been enough to trigger a formal investigation, and within weeks additional victims had come forward, women from New Jersey, Delaware, even as far as Maryland. Gerald's operation, it turned out, was larger than anyone had suspected. The properties he'd acquired were frozen pending court review. Some of the investors would eventually recover a portion of their money. Most wouldn't. As for the nearly $800,000 that Lorraine had transferred from their joint accounts, the money was gone. Gerald had moved it through a series of offshore entities that were effectively untraceable. Harriet did her best, but even her considerable skills couldn't unwind the labyrinth of shell companies and foreign banks. "I'm sorry," she told Earl during one of their final meetings. "I know this isn't the outcome you were hoping for." Earl shrugged. "The outcome I was hoping for was Lorraine seeing the truth. Everything else is just details." "That's very philosophical for a man who lost his retirement. I'm 73 years old. How much retirement do I really need?" Harriet smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "You're a strange man, Earl Hutchins." "So I've been told." Winter came. The snow fell. Earl shoveled his driveway with the same methodical care he'd always applied, though his shoulders ached more now, and he had to rest every few minutes. Nettie came home for Christmas, along with her husband and their 2 teenage children. Grandchildren Earl had seen only in photographs for the past 3 years. They filled the quiet house with noise and laughter, and Earl found himself smiling more than he had in months. On Christmas Eve, while the grandchildren were occupied with video games in the living room, Nettie found her father in the garage, sorting through a box of old tools. "Dad?" He looked up. "Hey, Nettie bird. You okay?" "Just thinking." She sat on the workbench beside him. "About Mom?" "About everything." He picked up an old wrench, one his father had given him decades ago, the metal worn smooth from years of use. "You know, I spent my whole life working with my hands, building things, fixing things. That's what I was good at." "You were great at it." "Maybe. But somewhere along the way I forgot that some things can't be fixed with a wrench. Some things need," he trailed off. "Words? Words. Attention. Presence. All the things I didn't know how to give." He set the wrench down. "Your mother and I, we never learned how to talk to each other. Really talk. We learned how to coexist, how to manage, but never how to be truly together." Nettie was quiet for a moment. "She's coming back, you know." Earl's heart stuttered. "What?" "Mom, she called me yesterday. She's been doing a lot of work, with the therapist on her own. She said—" Nettie hesitated. "She said she wants to try. If you're willing." Earl stared at his daughter. "She said that?" "She said she spent 50 years blaming you for everything that was wrong, and then she spent 2 years falling for a con man who told her everything she wanted to hear. And now for the first time in her life she's trying to figure out who she is, without either of those narratives. And she wants to try... with me? She wants to try something new. Not the marriage you had before. She says that's dead, and it should be. But maybe something else, a friendship, a partnership, something built on honesty instead of silence." Earl felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight for 50 years. "When?" he asked. "She's flying in tomorrow, Christmas Day." The snow had stopped falling, and the sun was breaking through the clouds for the first time in days. She walked up the path to the front door, the same path she'd walked 10,000 times before, but something was different now. Her shoulders were straighter, her eyes were clearer. Earl met her at the door. They stood there for a long moment, 2 old people who had hurt each other more than they could measure, trying to find the words that should have been spoken decades ago. "Hi," Lorraine finally said. "Hi. Can I come in?" Earl stepped aside. "Always. For hours, for days, for weeks. Not about the money. That was gone, and grieving it wouldn't bring it back. Not about Gerald. He was in jail now, awaiting trial on multiple counts of fraud and elder abuse. Not even about the 50 years of silence and resentment that had poisoned everything. They talked about the future. It was a strange thing, at 73 and 71, to be planning for the future. But Earl found himself looking forward in a way he never had before. Not toward retirement, that concept had always felt like death warmed over, but toward possibility. Lorraine moved into the guest room, not as a wife, but as a... what? Housemate? Partner? They hadn't figured out the right word yet. The labels didn't seem to matter as much anymore. She started taking classes at the community college. Not nursing. That ship had sailed, she said, and she'd made peace with it, but creative writing. She'd always loved stories, had always wanted to write her own. Earl, for his part, learned to cook. Actually cook, not just heat up cans and microwave frozen dinners. He followed recipes, made mistakes, set off the smoke alarm more than once. But slowly, he improved. And every evening they sat down together at that honey-coloured dining table, the one Lorraine had refinished 46 years ago, and they shared a meal. And they talked. Sometimes about the past, the hurts, the betrayals, the moments when everything could have been different if only they'd known how to speak. Sometimes about the present, the therapy sessions, the writing assignments, the grandchildren and their baffling video games. Sometimes about the future, the trips they wanted to take, the books they wanted to read, the people they wanted to become in whatever time they had left. And sometimes they just sat in silence, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of avoidance or suppression, the silence of two people who had finally stopped pretending, stopped hiding, stopped being afraid of what they might find if they looked too closely. The silence of peace. On the first anniversary of the text, as they'd taken to calling it, Earl and Lorraine sat on the back deck, wrapped in blankets against the October chill, watching the maple tree shed its leaves. 1 year, Lorraine said. 1 year. Feels longer. Feels shorter. Earl took a sip of his coffee. You know what I was thinking about this morning? What? That church picnic, 1974. The yellow sundress. Lorraine smiled. I still have that dress, you know, in a box in the attic. Haven't fit into it in 40 years, but I couldn't bear to throw it away. I remember thinking I'd never seen anyone so beautiful, and I remember being terrified that you'd notice me looking. I noticed. Her smile widened. Why do you think I laughed so loud when my sister told that stupid joke? I was trying to get your attention. It worked. Did it? Earl set down his coffee, reached over and took her hand, thin and cold and familiar. Yeah, he said. It worked. They sat there for a long time, two old people holding hands on a back deck they'd built together, watching the seasons change. The radiator clicked behind them. Some things you just learn to live with. Some things you finally learn to fix.